The person who, according to some polls at least, is going to be the next president of the United States has recently announced policy proposals that, whenever they've been tried throughout history, have led to empty shelves and, in some cases, mass starvation. This goes back to ancient Rome, to the case of Russia and China when they first became communist, and even more recently in Venezuela. In this video, I'm going to explain to you the problem with these proposals and why they inevitably lead to food shortages. Now, in case you think I'm overreacting and that we should trust our government officials, let's just remember how wrong they've been about the impact of inflation since 2020.
I really doubt that we're going to see an inflationary cycle.
It will have a temporary or transitory impact.
The faster than expected increase in some of those prices is actually a good sign.
The overwhelming consensus is going to pop up a little bit and then go back down. No one's talking about this great,
This is something that will settle down.
Transitory.
Most of the price increases we've seen were expected and are expected to be temporary. It's highly unlikely that's going to be long-term inflation that's going to get out of hand. I don't know anybody who's worried about inflation.
Over the last couple of months, we actually saw it trended downward.
President Biden's chief of staff, Ron Klain, enthusiastically retweeted an economist who had said, in part, most of the economic problems we're facing, inflation, supply chains, et cetera, are high-class problems.
Specifically, Kamala Harris has recently proposed that as a way to combat rising food prices at the grocery store, her administration, if elected, would implement controls on what she calls price gouging. Let's take a listen.
And I will work to pass the first ever federal ban on price gouging on food. My plan will include new penalties for opportunistic companies that exploit crises and break the rules, and we will support smaller food businesses that are trying to play by the rules and get ahead.
There's numerous things wrong with Kamala Harris's proposals. Let's just walk through this step by step. In the first place, let's just document how severe the increase in food prices have been. And here, I'm just going to use the government's own numbers. So here we see the year-over-year increase in the component of the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, referring to food at home. And as you can see, it peaked at 13.5% back in August 2022. Now, at that time, that was the highest year-over-year increase going all the way back to February 1979. Incidentally, this is government data, as I say, and I think that this vastly understates the actual amount of total food price inflation that Americans have experienced. According to these figures, it's only a cumulative 27% over the last 5 years. That is from summer of 2019 through summer of 2024. And I think most of us who have been shopping this whole time think that no, prices at the grocery store are a lot higher than a cumulative 27%. But even on the government's own terms, again, as I say, you see that year-over-year increase was the highest since 1979, despite all the talk about how great Joe Biden's economy is. And this is just a myth cooked up by Fox News for Americans who are belly aching. Now, just to explain a little bit about what other elements could be at work here and how could these official government statistics be underplaying it, there's all sorts of corrections and things that stores are using in order to contain their costs. Right. So, for example, and I noticed this trend even during the rounds of QE when a lot of input prices were going up. For example, cereal box manufacturers would use much thinner cardboard. All right. The paper towels and toilet paper got noticeably thinner during those years of QE, and that trend has continued. There's also, of course, the well-documented example of what's called shrinkflation, where the manufacturers put less product in the packaging and yet try to contain the price hikes that way. So in theory, some of those measures should be captured in the official CPI data, but there's all sorts of other things that clearly would not be. So for example, at least where I go shopping, the introduction of self-checkout at first was a novelty where there'd be like a couple registers where you could do a self-checkout if you just had a few items, but it was still many banks of employee-run cash registers. And then over time, that was just phased out. And now the local Walmart that I go to, for example, there is a huge bank of self-checkout that's overseen by an employee or two, and you're lucky if there's one register open, right? And so for those of us, if we're going shopping with a bunch of rambunctious kids and we got to cart full of groceries, it's pretty inconvenient to have to go and bag everything while you're trying to keep your kids from killing each other. And so that's just one way that the grocery stores have contained their costs, right? They can economize on how many employees they have if they're effectively getting the customer to not only go put the food in their cart, but also to bag it and ring it out and pay and so forth and leave with very little employee oversight. So that's just one example showing how the overall cost of getting food from the grocery stores has risen by more than what the official price tag per gallon of milk or per pound of hamburger meat would indicate. Now, what's interesting about Kamala Harris's proposal and all the rhetoric coming from progressives on this is, of course, they like to blame corporate greed, market power, things like that. But that sort of raises the question, remember the chart I showed a moment ago, why is it that corporate greed and market power increased so rapidly in 2022 and then subsided? Did corporations all of a sudden get greedy just that one year, that particular summer, and then had a sudden recognition of the virtues of selflessness afterward? No. Blaming corporate greed for rising prices at the grocery store is a bit like having a plane crash and then blaming gravity. Yes, gravity is certainly involved in the explanation, but when you want to know how come that plane crashed, whereas these other ones didn't, to just say, well, because of gravity, that's not really a good explanation. And the same thing here, to understand why is it that not since 1979 has the food at home component of the CPI increased so rapidly in the 12-month span as it did back in 2022. To understand that, what was so unique about 2022, you can't just appeal to, oh yeah, corporations are greedy and they want to exploit people. Obviously, there were other things at work. So what do I think is a much more satisfactory explanation? Well, as an economist, I like to go to a monetary explanation. So here we see a chart showing the M2 money stock versus, which is the blue line, versus the consumer price index and specifically the food at home component. And that's the red line. So as you can see, over the decades, they tend to go up hand in hand. And then in particular, right after the COVID lockdowns were implemented, you can see that by the gray recession bar, you see that the Federal Reserve pumped a bunch of new money in. That's why the monetary level spikes there. And that's soon afterward when you start seeing the level of food at home prices begin to spike as well. And then also as the M2 money stock peaked and then actually gently fell in more recent years, you see the same thing happen, same pattern with food prices, that they rose rapidly and then they leveled off and are now just gently rising. Again, this is all using the government's own numbers, of course. So appealing to swings in the money stock is a much more satisfactory explanation for why is it that prices at the grocery store behave this way. And when you step back and think about it, that's not really a very shocking explanation or wacky theory to say that when the government dumps boatloads of new money into the economy, and particularly the institutional arrangements that we saw post-COVID, where there were stimulus checks where the new money effectively was being spread around to everybody, as opposed to the rounds of QE during the Obama years when it was mostly, asset purchases given to the banking sector, and there wasn't as broad a distribution of the money through outright government support of everybody the way there were with the stimulus checks during the lockdowns, than to see prices. Now, of course, supply side bottlenecks played an issue as well. I don't want to downplay that, but clearly explaining the rising unit price of food has more to do with how many dollars we're chasing given amounts of food and the fact that the government introduced supply chain bottlenecks by restricting the flow of goods. Now, Kamala Harris's proposal to crack down on price gouging is a bit vague, right? And infamously, people are pointing out that even if you go to her official campaign website, it's very scant on details. We don't really know what she's going to do. We just know she's not Donald Trump, right? She's not endorsing what she was saying when she ran for president last time. She's certainly not running on Joe Biden's administration. She's not saying this is just going to be a repeat of that. And so it's actually a bit open-ended and vague as to what she wants to do. But to the extent that we can assume she means, among other things, that there are going to be measures in place to limit what food prices can be, right, to impose what's called a price ceiling, then the effects of that are crystal clear, both in terms of theory and plenty of examples from history. So here's a diagram from my textbook, Lessons for the Young Economist. The specific context here is a market for apartment units. And so you've got your supply curve, which slopes upward, your demand curve, which slopes downward. And with these particular numbers in this example, I suppose that the market clearing price is $800 per apartment unit. And at that price, the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, and that corresponds to 10,000 units. Now, when we say the supply curve slopes upward or the demand curve slopes downward, all that means is that other things equal, if the price of something is higher, suppliers want to bring more of it to market and buyers want to buy less of it. And vice versa, if the price is lower, then suppliers don't want to sell as much and buyers want to buy more. Now, in the typical economics textbooks, we draw nice smooth lines. We're not saying in reality it's like that. They could be jagged sort of staircase patterns, if you will. But still, the general idea that if something has a higher price, other things equal, suppliers want to bring more of it to market and vice versa with demand, that's not a very controversial claim. I think people were really just reflecting on your own behavior, that seems pretty natural and intuitive. Now, if you go along with that, just for the sake of argument, what does that mean? It means if the government comes along, returning to our example of the apartments, and they say, you know what, a price in this city right now, given the conditions of $800 per unit is unconscionably high. There's a lot of low-income people that can't afford that. Why don't we make it illegal for landlords to charge more than $650? We'll have what's called rent control, put a ceiling on the acceptable legal amount that you can charge for rent, at least for certain types of units in certain neighborhoods and so on. Well, if supply curves are upward sloping and demand curves are downward sloping, and we just said a minute ago that in this example, let's suppose the market clearing price is $800 per unit, and if now the most a landlord can charge is $650, what's going to happen? At that lower price, people are going to bring fewer apartment units to market, right? People who are renting out a spare bedroom might instead of it, since now they can earn less for it per month, they might instead just keep it as a spare room for when their kid comes home from college, or, if they have people from out of town visiting, right? That people make decisions on the margin. It's not that every single apartment unit is going to disappear because of the $150 change, but certainly in a big city, the total number of units that landlords want to rent out at $650 a pop is going to be less than it is at $800. And so in this particular example, I assume that the quantity of apartment units available to be rented out drops from 10,000 down to 9,000. On the flip side, as apartment units become less expensive, there's more total demand for it, right? Certain roommates who were getting on each other's nerves, but they knew they couldn't each swing $800 a month in rent, and they were living together and splitting an apartment. Now, if apartments get cheaper, maybe on the margin, some of them will move out and try to get their own place. Again, not that every single person will make that decision and all roommates will move out because of a $150 price change, but the idea is in a big enough city, certainly the lower price will lead to a greater number of people trying to get a greater number of apartment units at that price. And so in this example, I assumed that the quantity of apartments that people wanted to get would rise from 10,000 units to 12,000 units at the lower price. But what does that mean? Now, instead of the market clearing, we've got this imbalance of 3,000 units, and that's what economists call a shortage. Okay, and this is why, or to connect this to the real world, this is why it's so hard to get an apartment in big cities where there's rent control. All right, when I was a grad student at NYU, I experienced this firsthand. Right, you had to know somebody to know how to get into an apartment. Or, my older roommate from undergrad, we both moved to New York. He got lucky and got into a place. And how did that happen? Because he knew somebody. It was a cousin that had a rent controlled place, and the cousin was getting married. So he had to move up, but hey, they were going to keep it in the family. And so he let my friend move in there, and my friend had to do things like make sure he emptied out the mailbox, and he had his mail sent to me, and I would just periodically bring it to him because his cousin said, we can't let the mailman know that I've moved out. So I can't, you can't be getting your mail here. And why is that? Because again, they have all these extensive regulations on price controls. And that just, that's going to lead into what we're going to get to in a moment. Just when you let the governments get their foot in the door by starting to regulate with price controls, for example, it just leads to unintended consequences, which invites more and more regulations, right? Just in that specific example, well, gee, if you're going to have a price ceiling on apartment rents, then people are going to be doing deals behind the scenes and giving it to their buddies, and we don't want that. And so if the mailman lets us know someone's moved out, then maybe we can raise the price a little bit according to the statute, right? So it leads to all this craziness. Okay, specifically, another example of price controls from U.S. history, those who are older and watching this video, you may remember the long gas lines, or maybe you've seen pictures of it in the U.S. in the 1970s. And conventionally, a lot of people like to blame that on OPEC. And they say, oh yeah, the OPEC nations, for various geopolitical reasons, put an embargo on the U.S. in the 70s, and that's why the price of crude went up and there were lines of the gas. No. The OPEC embargo explains why the price of crude oil would skyrocket. It would explain why the market clearing price of gasoline would skyrocket at the pump, but it doesn't explain why there would be long lines at the pump. Why is it that people are trying to buy more units of gasoline than sellers want to sell? And there, the explanation is because the Nixon administration imposed wage and price controls. And specifically, there were controls on the price of gasoline, right? Thinking, oh, we're doing a favor for drivers by putting a ceiling on the price to wipe out unconscionable price gouging of the American motorist. And so what did that do? That wasn't doing them any favors. What it meant was, again, more people were trying to buy gallons of gasoline than the retailers wanted to sell at that price. Right? And this isn't mysterious. If you're a seller and your costs of production go up and you want to pass that through to the final price that you charge your customers, and the government comes in and says, no, it's illegal. You're not allowed to raise your price more than by a certain percentage each year or whatever the regulation is, such that now it's not profitable for you to do as much business, you're going to cut back. You're not going to operate at a loss just because the government has that rule in place. You will just refrain from the activity if you're a merchant. And that's what we see throughout history. So again, the lines you saw at the pump in the 1970s in the United States was not directly because of the OPEC embargo on oil. It was rather because of the Nixon administration's price controls. And then once those controls were relaxed, you saw the lines disappear. Now, Kamala Harris, again, is not explicitly talking about price controls. Instead, she's attacking this more vague notion of market power and price gouging. And so what that does is it opens up the idea that, oh, no, we're okay if grocery stores, for example, pass through legitimate cost hikes. It's just we don't want them to take advantage of the situation and really squeeze their customers under cover of the COVID bottlenecks or what have you. Okay. And you might have even seen people talking about how grocery store profit margins were at record highs in recent years. Okay. But even there, the rhetoric is a bit misleading. Right? So it's true. Back in 2019, the profit margin of grocery stores was about 1%. And it did rise, and it peaked in 2020. And you know what it peaked at? 3%. So the margin in the grocery store industry between what the stores pay for the food and then how much they mark it up before passing it along, even at its peak in 2020, was 3%. And since then, it's fallen back down. As of 2023, it was 1.6%. Okay, so again, this narrative that you're being fed about grocery stores really sticking it to their customers is very misleading. The real culprit, as I've been saying, is the boatloads of money they dumped into the system. Now, let me take things a bit further. It's not simply that grocery stores have not been enjoying huge profit margins where they're exploiting their customers, but even beyond that, in a genuine emergency, allowing so-called record or windfall profits is actually socially useful. All right, so let me explain. There's two different elements here involved. On the one hand, the high prices act as a deterrent to excessive consumption, and that rations the available stockpile for those in the community who really need it. All right, so let's just take an example. Let's say that there's some coastal region and there's a hurricane that's coming, and the forecasters say, hey, this hurricane's going to be bad. It's going to hit us starting, tomorrow at noon. Everybody get ready. If you're able to leave town, board your place up and whatever, take your valuables and get out of town if you can. The authorities are recommending you evacuate. And so in a situation like that, left to its own devices in the market economy, you might see gasoline prices spike, right? Because everybody's going to go to the gas station and try to fill up before they get on the interstate and get out of there. And so maybe gas goes from $3.50 a gallon and it spikes up to $10 a gallon left to its own devices, right? And so people would be outraged and they would say, oh, the attorney general should set up a hotline and we're going to bring these gasoline station owners before the tribunal for their price gouging. Now, why would that be a bad idea? As an economist, what would I say is a criticism of that policy? Why is that actually hurting the community to have those measures, even though they're very intuitive and you understand why people would be upset in a situation like that? Because let me use an analogy. Suppose you were a military base commander and you had a base that was right on the coast and there was a hurricane coming and you get orders coming down from the chain of command saying, hey, you need to evacuate all of the soldiers on your base in as many vehicles as you can and just get them out of there, out of the path of this hurricane. What would you do? And you only have limited stockpiles of gasoline on hand. Would you have the Jeeps and so forth all line up in a line, and then the first few that get to the gas station part of the base, would they all just fill up and then go, and then the rest of the vehicles are out of luck? No, what you would do is you would say, okay, where is the next refilling option? Whether they go to a conventional gas station or if there's some military base that's further inland that they can go to where they can refuel at that point. So you would just say, okay, all the vehicles that have enough fuel to not need any more right now, but can make it to the next checkpoint, go ahead, leave. And then of the remaining vehicles, let's give you just enough fuel so you can get to the next point. And that way we're going to ration the available fuel we have on the base to go around to evacuate as many vehicles as possible. Right? You'd probably do something like that. And notice that's exactly what would happen, at least the pattern of that, if we're talking about a decentralized market economy with civilians in charge of their respective vehicles. When the gas in the coastal region spikes to $10 a gallon, somebody who's got half a tank is probably going to say, you know what, I'm not going to get more here. Let's get in the car. Let's drive on the interstate 100 miles inland, and let's check out gas prices once we get out of the path of this incoming hurricane. And those vehicles that were running on fumes when the news broke about the impending hurricane, they need to get some gas. They can't make it to the next gas station on the interstate. They've only got 5 miles left in the tank, but they're probably not going to fill up when it's $10 a gallon. They're probably only going to put in enough to reasonably get away from the area and to check out the gas prices and see if they drop once you get out of that zone, right? So notice the high price is a signal that helps everybody coordinate when you don't actually have a military commander at the base barking orders at people, right? In a free society, people are allowed to make their own decisions, but market prices give them feedback and help guide them so that their actions collectively make use of scarce resources in an efficient manner. That's the function of market prices. And so when Kamala Harris comes along and says effectively, I'm not going to let market prices do their job, that's going to have consequences. And on the other hand, besides just high prices helping to economize on the demand, it also elicits emergency supplies, right? It's like, think of something like bottled water, right? If there's an area that has been hit by a natural disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, what have you, in the region, maybe the drinking water isn't safe temporarily, or other things are, interrupting the normal flow, and bottled water all of a sudden jumps up to $5 a bottle, just for a little bottle. And people could be outraged and say that's price gouging, it's unconscionable, but you want that to happen. You want to allow that as a policymaker, because then that is the incentive. Guys in neighboring regions who weren't affected by the natural disaster, they can take their pickup truck down to Walmart and load up on cases of bottled water and then drive in to the affected area, right? And they would be willing to make runs doing that if the price is $5 a bottle. Whereas if the attorney general sets up a hotline and says, hey, if you catch anybody trying to sell it at gouging level prices here for essentials like batteries and flashlights and generators and bottled water and gasoline, take a picture with your phone, and once the dust settles, we're going to go prosecute those people. Well, then guess what? The guys with the pickup trucks of the neighboring states who read about the situation of their poor fellow Americans who just got hit with this natural disaster, they might feel bad. They might say a prayer if they're so inclined, or express sympathy on a social media post, but they're probably not going to take their weekend going back and forth, driving hundreds of miles total, making runs, delivering bottled water to those people if they're just allowed to charge the quote normal price. Okay, so again, it's a matter of just saying, what behavior do you want to elicit from people? And market prices serve a function. They help coordinate activity. more generally, the profit and loss system works by saying those entrepreneurs who best anticipate future market conditions are the ones who earn profits. And so what it means, for example, even the grocery stores that earned above normal profits during the pandemic years, they were in the right business at the right time. Now, we can say that wasn't because of their superior acumen in terms of fundamentals, that it was arbitrary government restrictions. You can say that, but nonetheless, given that the government imposed lockdowns, people needed to get their food from grocery stores as opposed to going out to eat as much, right? Because that was forbidden. And so those entrepreneurs who had the capacity to expand their operations and to allow for more people to get food at home, and that includes things like Amazon being able to ship directly to your house, and then the rise of the services of people going to stores and loading up in their car and delivering it and so on. The people who had those networks ready to crank up the dial on performed a valuable service. Again, you can say that shouldn't have been the case if we had had more sensible government policies. But the point is, given what the government policies were, those firms that rose to the challenge and best catered to the needs of the American people in that critical moment, those are the ones that earned above normal profits. And that's exactly what you want to happen. Let me just give a more esoteric example of the kind of thing I mean, just to show it's wrong to think of the amount of infrastructure or resources on hand when a disaster hits, to think that that's just a fact of nature. It's not. That also is an economic outcome that has to do with government policy. So specifically, let's say, to return the example of bottled water, right? Some earthquake or other kind of natural disaster hits your area, and that's why temporarily it's hard for people to get access to water. And so that's why the amount of bottled water on hand, left to its own devices, demand shifts to the right and supply shifts to the left, and the market price would skyrocket. The amount, though, on hand is itself the result of earlier economic decisions. And so, for example, the people who maintain inventory in a certain area, especially if it's one that's prone to hurricanes and so on, if they think that, I live in a free society where the government allows consenting adults to charge mutually agreeable prices when they trade bottles of water for money, then they're going to, in equilibrium, to use the economist's jargon, hold higher inventories of bottled water, right? If they think there's even a 0.1% chance that there could be some kind of disaster, and at least for a week, the price of bottled water is going to jump to $5 per bottle, then I, as a large retailer, when I'm figuring out at any given time how many cases of bottled water do I want to have in my inventory on hand, you're going to err on the side of a bigger number if you think there's even a slight chance, once in a while, that the price of those things is going to skyrocket, right? Because in those situations, you make so much more per unit that when you're originally deciding, okay, like how much warehouse space do I want to build? And of that warehouse space, how much do I want to devote to cases of water? How much to cans of tuna fish? You got to make all these decisions. And I'm saying to know that, occasionally, again, especially if you're in a region that's prone to these types of occurrences, even if it's only every few years, still, that's something that you should take into account. If you're a wise planner, that's exactly what we would want you to take into account, right? If you're in an area that occasionally gets hit with severe events, such that bottled water becomes a hot commodity, at least temporarily, then you would want the merchants in that region to carry larger stockpiles of bottled water compared to merchants in other areas where that never happens, right? That's exactly what you would want. That's the socially responsible thing to do. And so in a market economy, what mechanism brings forth that outcome? It's the fact that the authorities don't crack down when market prices temporarily spike because of some kind of disaster. All right. Now, if you're concerned about the plight of the poor or what have you, the government could set up assistance. I would prefer it be voluntary charities and so on. But I'm saying, given if you're saying, no, the government's got to, quote, do something, okay, but then even there, have people get financial support so they can pay the prices for, the batteries or whatever. Another element, too, with all this, you want to make sure that the people who first get to the store don't clear the shelves out and put a bunch of cases in their shopping cart, right? That's one of the functions of having the bottled water be expensive, is that households will only get what they really need to get through the crisis. Again, to ration the available supply to as many households as possible. So that's what you want to do if you live in a free society, to allow everybody to work together and coordinate on what's actually the socially beneficial outcome for everybody. Okay, now you might be saying, yeah, that's great in theory, Murphy, but come on, is this really a big deal empirically? And the answer is yes. This isn't simply dogmatic ideological battles over things that in the grand scheme don't affect average people. No, as I've said, throughout history, we have plenty examples of governments who do this 1-2 punch, where they first debase the currency, and then when prices rise and the public gets outraged, particularly when prices rise on essentials like food, then the government comes in and seeks to crack down on the very thing that they themselves caused by inflating the money stock or debasing the currency back in the day when there were actual gold and silver coins. And then the government will come in and say, oh, if any merchant is caught raising prices too rapidly, we're going to punish you. And so then again, what happens? The obvious, predictable result, food disappears from the shelves. This happened back in Rome. The economist Ludwig von Mises explained, why was it that the emperors, after a while succumbed to the waves of invading barbarians, even though earlier ones had managed to fend off those attacks. And he was saying part of the explanation is that Rome had engaged in currency debasement, and they coupled that with price controls. And so a lot of the people in the cities no longer could find food, and so they fled and they went out in the countryside because they had to forage, since the main way that they used to be fed no longer worked. And in many cases, they welcomed the, quote, barbarian invaders with open arms because they were starving. Right, so Mises is saying something as significant as the fall of Rome, he could attribute, at least in part, to inflation coupled with price controls. Okay. More recently, we've seen the case of Venezuela, for example, where well-to-do middle-class people couldn't go to work. They had to walk to neighboring countries to get basic supplies like toilet paper and food. And why was that? Again, the same story. The socialist government first dumped boatloads of new money into the economy that caused rapid price increases. And then, in response to the public outcry, the government blamed the greedy merchants and so on, and international currency speculators attacking their currency and blah, 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 the capitalist lapdogs of finance. And they made it illegal for the food distribution centers to charge higher prices. And so the food disappeared from the shelves. And it's just amazing to see how often this happens. And even allegedly Western media don't understand. I was listening to an article at the time, or a piece, I think it was NPR, talking about what was happening in Venezuela and, why weren't people able to get essential foodstuffs and toilet paper and so on. And their explanation was, oh, well, because the military has these stockpiles and they're supposed to be handing it out, but yet the corrupt military officials will often just bring it home to their own families, or they'll sell it on the black market. And it's sort of, so the reason nobody can get food in Venezuela in this period is because the military is hoarding it up. And it kind of raises the question, well, how come other countries around the world don't need their military to be handing out food to people? Why were they in this predicament in the first place, such that corrupt military officials were the deciding line between you getting toilet paper or not? And the answer, of course, is because the government had dumped boatloads of new money into the system to prop up their socialist regime, and then they imposed price controls. This happens all the time when governments couple these two measures together. Now, we aren't at this point yet, but I want to just point out that throughout history, we also have examples where the government has even intervened more heavily in the distribution of food, and the result has been disaster. All right, so China, for example, from 1959 through 1961, there was a massive famine. Some 30 million Chinese starved. All right, and there was also a huge drop in their GDP in 1960, according to the official measures. Okay, so say what you will about Mao, but he didn't do a good job of feeding his people, right? The great leap forward by which he was going to modernize China resulted in massive, massive death and starvation. And in a case like that, you can say, was that due to just him punishing political opponents? Or was it just, hey, we were trying our best to feed people? For our purposes, it doesn't really matter. I'm more cynical myself. I think a lot of this was intentional. But either way, the point is, you do not want the government to get more authority to intervene in food distribution, they're not going to use it to help people. They themselves are the ones who caused the original problem. The solution is to get the government out of it. Other notorious examples, tens of million people died in the two famines that occurred in Russia between 1921 and 23, and then later between 1932 and 1933. You can see in this chart, for example, showing the percent of deaths versus births, and you can see the huge spike there in the early 1930s, just to get an idea of how much the communist experiment in Russia led to mass starvation and misery. Again, not saying that Kamala Harris is secretly plotting to starve millions of people, but I'm more saying this notion of, hey, there's a problem we don't like, food's expensive all of a sudden, let's give the government more power to intervene in food markets, and that will fix things. No, you do not want these people in charge of getting food to your family. They are the ones who are responsible for the problem in the first place. Again, a better explanation that fits the data, the government's own data. When COVID hit, the Federal Reserve opened up the monetary spigots. The federal government began literally paying people to stay home from work with stimulus checks and lockdowns. What do you think is going to happen to the price of food at the grocery store? It's going to skyrocket. And now, even though the price hikes have moderated as the Federal Reserve has reversed course, trying to contain price hikes, Kamala Harris is campaigning on cracking down on price gouging. If she actually were to implement these policies, it would lead to disaster. So at best, we can hope she's just spouting campaign rhetoric in order to get elected. And when she's in there, in deference to the politically connected corporations and such, she won't actually push it through. But that's the best outcome, is that maybe she's just kidding. More generally, why is this important? Because I think we are on the eve of a financial crash. As I've explained in an earlier video, which you can see here, the economic indicators for our current time are eerily similar to what happened back in the summer of 2007. And at that point, we were just about entering into the recession that would be later called the Great Recession. And then, of course, a year later, we had the global financial crisis. So again, I think the conditions right now are eerily similar to what we faced back then. And I point you to our video to see why. Thanks for your attention, everybody, for viewing another Infinio video. Come back for more in the future.